Hey, if you're interested in AdventureTech's racing links for the 2018 Suzuki Vstrom, stick with me and we're going to show you how to install them. We're going to review them, ride around a little bit off-road and on-road, and we're going to see if they're worth it and if they make the Vstrom a better off-road bike. Let's quickly talk about the tools you're going to need for this. You'll need a ratchet wrench. You'll need an extender of some sort, that way you can easier reach these bolt heads. A 15mm wrench, a 17mm wrench. You'll need your 12mm socket and your 14mm socket. And you're definitely going to need some kind of a torque wrench to install everything, per spec. And I will mention the torque settings. You're also going to need some kind of a block or 2x4 to help support the wheel when you're taking off the last one. Okay, so let's talk really quick about what you need to do. First, put your bike on a center stand if you have one. This triangular link, there's two of them, one on the driver's side and one on the passenger side. You're going to want to remove them in this order of operation. Up in the front, you have a 12mm head bolt. On the back of it is a nut that holds it, and that nut is 15mm. You're going to want a wrench. Next, you have two identical bolts on the back. You have one on the top and one on the bottom. These heads are 14mm heads, and they're backed up by a 17mm nut. Again, you'll need another wrench for that 17mm nut on the back. What you want to do is remove the front first, that 12mm bolt. Remove it carefully, make sure nothing falls out. There are bearings in between the spacers. Just when you pull the bolt out, make sure it's loose, it's not pushing or pulling anything out. After the front side, we'll do the top side. And after the top side, we're going to have to kind of lift the wheel a little bit to expose the bottom one behind this little chain guard and remove the bottom one. So let's get started. $12mm socket here. If you were hoping that you won't have to use a wrench in the back, you're wrong, because you probably will. What happens is the nut wants to twist with the bolt. Here's my 15mm nut. Okay, here it is. There's that 12mm head bolt. If you don't want to worry about keeping that wrench on the back, you can try loosening the head for a little, and then when it gets a little loose, you can throw that wrench back on there, and you may not need both hands at this point. So you kind of loosened it up a little. Just use one hand on the socket. Here is the 14mm bolt head. Set that aside. So, in order to get access to the bolt, in my case, I have a chain guard in the way. What I need to do is actually lift the wheel up. So what I do is I just take one or two of my 2x4s and I'll lift the wheel up and slide it under and see if that gives me a little more working area. And you can pivot this piece, that dog bone link that connects the chassis to the swing arm. As you can see, I just lifted it up and there's my bolt. Now I've got full access to it. Loosen it up, throw my 17mm wrench on the nut, and take it off. This final bottom bolt, behind the head of the bolt and behind the nut on the back, are two thin washers. Get my bolt out and carefully remove both cushion links. These are the factory ones, they're metal. Like I said, you have the two washers. Carefully set those aside. The way these go is, obviously there's three holes. You'll notice at the front, pointy, the acute side is a smaller hole. That's for your smaller bolt. So you want the curved edge to be on the top, just like it was when you had your factory ones. So you're gonna have one going like this, and on the other side, in the same orientation, you'll have the other one. So we need to go in reverse order. That means we need to install the lower bolt with those washers, those spacers, inside with the 2 new cushion links. So we'll carefully slide that in. And when you slide these bolts in, like I said, be careful not to push the bearing inside of the hardware out. And finally, the 17mm nut. Go ahead and hand tighten that. You don't need to tighten it all the way because you want this thing to be a little bit loose. That way you can move it around and align the remainder of the bolts. The front bolt is hand tight now. At this point, what you're going to find is the bottom bolt, in order to torque it, you won't be able to if you have a center stand with this chain guard piece to it, because it's exactly in your way. There's a couple of ways to mitigate this. You can somehow raise the wheel up by either sitting on the bike and moving this link up as the suspension moves. You can also, just for the moment, I'm going to use a 14mm wrench, because that's the size of the head of the bolt. I'm going to go ahead and put my 17mm wrench on the back for the nut. And unfortunately, I'm going to hand tighten this all the way as much as I can, because I have no access to this with the regular kind of sockets that I have. Now everything is hand tightened. So the 2 14mm head bolts are 71 foot-pounds of torque with the torque wrench. And the one in the front, the 12mm head bolt, that one is 36.5 foot-pounds of torque.
29.5 inches.
29.5. And then let me sit on. Go ahead.
28.25 inches.
28.25. First impression. I have lifted my rear suspension by 1 1/8 or whatever. The bike does feel a little taller because I've been riding it for thousands of miles at the factory settings, and I kind of, muscle memory kind of knows where my feet land when I put them down. And the first time you kind of stop and put your feet down, you're like, oh, whoa, the ground is now a little bit further than it used to be. So, and that's a good thing for me. That was obviously my primary goal, was to get a little bit of more clearance underneath the bike. It's not a whole lot, but it makes me feel like at least I'm not losing clearance when I add a thicker skid plate on the bottom of the engine. It feels like you're leaned forward a little more. In other words, your butt's a little higher, so obviously you're kind of a little sportier position. Again, very tiny difference, but enough to notice after riding for thousands of miles on the previous settings. Feels like I'm sitting more on top of the bike instead of inside of the bike now. So, is the Vstrom more capable with the raising links? I don't know. In theory, well, when we look at motorcycles and we compare them, we have a habit of looking at the specs on paper. We say, oh, okay, this bike has 9 inches of clearance, this bike has 7, this bike has 240 millimeters of clearance on the forks, or, travel, etc. You have to ride it in person, though, because I think what ultimately matters is, where do you fit on the bike as a rider? Is the bike beyond your skill? In other words, are you going to cap out because your bike doesn't have enough clearance? You're a former motocross racer and the bike's just not good enough for you? Or are you, maybe you don't feel comfortable. You don't feel comfortable with a bike that's spec'd as not as capable as a KTM or something. So I think it depends on the rider. For me, I know that I have to work a little bit harder to get this bike to catch up with the guys on the dual sports, but it's fun. It's a challenge for me, and it puts a smile on my face when I'm staying up with a pack of 250s and 450s. And so yeah, AdventureTech, if you've never heard of them and you have a Vstrom, then you should definitely check out the store, because These Stroms don't get enough attention as far as off-roading. And that's fine, but AdventureTech fixes that problem, addresses a lot of the parts and aftermarket upgrades that a lot of guys want. So I'm very excited about that. Everything's very affordable. I wouldn't say it's expensive. It seems reasonable. It's all custom made, so definitely not bad. So hopefully this video was helpful to those of you that are looking into these AdventureTech racing links. And if you're not, then hopefully you just enjoyed the video. And if you do have any experience with raising or lowering your bike, especially a V-Strom, please let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to know your feedback. This was my first experience, and it'd be really great to know everybody else's thoughts and opinions. So, till next time.